You know, Eric, on this show, time and time again, founders talk about the importance of hiring great employees.
And they always say it's so hard and so important early on to hire the right person.
It makes a lot of sense that it's difficult because most founders don't have experience doing high-level searches or hiring top-level talent.
And they're also limited to their local talent pool a lot of the times.
That's why a lot of founders choose to work with SPMB, one of the fastest growing executive search firms in the country. For over 40 years, SPMB has specialized in recruiting upper management and board members to early stage VC-funded startups and larger growth stage companies too.
They bring the knowledge of a large global firm and combine it with the personalized service and attention of a boutique.
They have a dedicated team focusing on the Mountain West and Midwest emerging tech markets, so no matter where you are in the country, if you're trying to hire top-level talent, SPMB can help you out.
If that sounds like you can go to upside.fm/SPMB to learn how they are closing hundreds of C-level searches annually.
The startup investment landscape is changing, and world-class companies are being built outside of Silicon Valley. We find them, talk with them, and discuss the upside of investing in them. Welcome to Upside.
Hello, and welcome to the Upside Podcast, the first podcast finding upside outside of Silicon Valley. I'm Eric Hornung, and I'm accompanied by my co-host, Mr. Peanut Butter and Jelly himself, Jay Klaus. How's it going, Jay?
I haven't eaten lunch today. You're making me hungry.
Are you a peanut butter and jelly guy? I gave you that nickname without knowing.
You know, I'm not, at least not historically. I am a peanut butter guy, for sure. I would take a peanut butter sandwich over a peanut butter jelly sandwich any day. However, in my adulthood, I have come to appreciate both jellies and jams, and I think I'm due to give it another shot because people seem to love the combination, the merger of these two food stuffs. Are the jelly, jam, peanut butter, they're not condiments, are they? How would we describe these things?
Spreads, maybe?
Ooh, spreads is good. Yes, the merger of two spreads.
That's the dating a CPG person in me, pull out the spreads word. Here's the thing about peanut butter and jelly. If you're going to give it a try again, you can't over jelly. That's the thing I've learned. People always put too much jelly on because it's easy to scoop out. Boom. Then you get soggy bread. It's not what you want.
This is a warning against over jellying. This is not saying it's impossible to over jelly, thereby suggesting that there's limitless amounts of jelly. Like you don't want to over jelly. Over jellying is bad.
Whenever you put two things together, it's all about ratios. And I think the perfect ratios of peanut butter and jelly, that's a nice sandwich. You put peanut butter on both sides, jelly in the middle, boom, beautiful. But it's all about ratios. It's all about having that perfect balance, Jay.
And a merger of perfect ratios is exactly what John Fein and Chris Marks are trying to do over at Firebrand Ventures. Eric, we spoke to John 3 years ago almost. When was our interview with John initially?
It's actually our second ever coffee chat. It was back in September of 2018.
Wow. We have been doing this for a while. Spoke to John of Firebrand in September of 2018. And then more recently, insert date here, Eric. When was the most recent one?
October 7th, 2020, almost over 2 years later.
We spoke with John and his new partner, Chris Marks, because Firebrand merged with Blue Note Ventures to create a consolidated Firebrand brand. And just this past week, they announced that they had closed on a $40 million fund, Firebrand Ventures 2. So it seems like they may be reaching that perfect peanut butter and jelly balance. Eric, what do you think?
Oh, I mean, it seems like it. If you come together like that and then you just go spit off a new fund, go support founders the way that they are, I think that that's definitely a 1 + 1 = 40 million type of move.
It sounds like these two guys are trying to live this one life they have to live the best way they can.
And if you want to live the one life you have the best way you can go to upside.fm/ethos to learn more.
We're going to do something a little weird in this episode, Eric. We're going to take those past two episodes, the first one with John and the second one with John and Chris, and we're going to make a bit of a Firebrand homage, a mega episode where we cut off the intros to those episodes. Maybe we'll leave a little bit of an intro. I don't know.
Who knows?
I don't know. We'll see.
Listen on to find
out. We're going to take those 2 episodes, play them back to back, so you get a 3-year chronological view of what's going on with Firebrand Ventures. John starting it, talking about his origins, followed by the merger with Chris Marks in 2020. And now you know the end of the story. You know how this ends. They have raised a $40 million fund. Fun story. And as we noted in the most recent episode with John and Chris, not the typical thing you see happening in venture. So we're interested to keep following the story, and that's why we're running this special episode. Alert the sirens.
Woo, woo, woo. Woo, woo. So here's the thing. We're going to take Coffee Chat 2, Coffee Chat 65, and much like peanut butter and jelly, we're going to put them together in the right ratio with some upside bread. We hope you enjoyed this mega episode. If you do, let us know. You can send us your thoughts at Upside FM on Twitter, or something a little longer at hello@upside.fm. And we will get to that mega episode, that perfectly balanced Firebrand sandwich, right after this.
Eric, we got to make some big changes to how we do operations here at Upside.
This feels like an intervention, Jay.
It's a bit of an intervention. I have to give you some tough love. We've had some calendar problems over the last couple weeks.
I've had some calendar problems. You don't have to throw the third person on this.
I do like to take the blame for you, but this one is on you. And Eric, I think we have found a solution to our calendar and scheduling problems.
But there are 101 scheduling tools out there, Jay, that can help you avoid the awkward dance of finding a time to meet.
But this tool is by far and away the best one I've seen, and I have looked at a lot of scheduling tools. And I am talking about SavvyCal.
SavvyCal makes it a collaborative effort, allowing you to personalize links and allow recipients to overlay their own calendar on top of yours.
It's going to make booking guests for Upside and even just one-on-one conversations a complete breeze. You gotta see what this looks like. You gotta see how it works, because you're gonna ask, why wasn't it always this easy?
You can sign up for a free account at savvycal.com/upside. That's SAVVYCAL.com/upside. And when you are ready to test out a paid plan, use the code UPSIDE to get your first month free.
The story goes, I had not raised $1 for the fund when I announced it, which was a sort of risky, calculated, decision to just trying to get the word out to people that this is what I'm doing. And again, just like, just so much support from different corners of the community. And what ended up happening was, what that turned into was 99.5% of the LPs in my fund are here in Kansas City.
The startup investment landscape is changing, and world-class companies are being built outside of Silicon Valley. We find them, talk with them, and discuss the upside of investing in them. Welcome to Upside.
Woo!
Hello, 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 and welcome to the Upside Podcast, the first podcast finding upside outside of Silicon Valley. I'm Eric Hornung, and I'm accompanied by my co-host, Mr. Insurance himself, Jay Klaus. How's it going, Jay?
Doing well. Calling in here from our Columbus Startup Weekend at Grange Insurance. I'm in a breakout room right now looking around at what I think to be key messages, key things to keep in mind. Actually, the name of this breakout room is the Not a Bad Idea Room. So maybe that's correlated to why we have things like key relationships and transformation and modernization and focused investments. And directly behind me, targeted growth.
Wow. You know what else isn't a bad idea? Changing topics and moving over to our intro.
Should be noted, listeners, that anytime Eric makes a nickname on this podcast, I don't know what's coming, and I'm just expected to respond to it. So you're getting it live.
You did a great job there. Today on the podcast, we are doing another one of our coffee chat series. I am very excited because this city for us has been a tough nut to crack.
Elusive. Today, we are talking to one of the staples of the Kansas City startup ecosystem, John Fein. John is the founder and managing partner of Firebrand Ventures, the venture firm that invests in the greater Midwest. We reached out to John. We had interacted with him a few times on Twitter,
And he was just on our list as somebody who we thought seemed like he shared a similar point of view to us, or maybe we shared a similar point of view to him, maybe more appropriate. But his fund, Firebrand, invests in the Midwest, and he is based in Kansas City. We have not featured a guest on the podcast yet from Kansas City, but that will be changing soon, thanks in large part to John, besides this interview itself.
Isn't it crazy how much value Twitter gives us and just people in general who want to connect? I feel like it's like the LinkedIn that LinkedIn should be.
So much opportunity. If you know how to use Twitter in all forms, right? Like your feed can be worthless or your feed can be fantastic depending on how you curate it. Yeah, we've made several relationships based solely on Twitter, which, you know, comes from having our Upside FM handle, so plug for @Upside FM, but a bio that talks about what we're doing and a little bit about our show. And, you know, you just engage with people. People are looking at their activity. They're looking at their mentions. Access is easier than you think a lot of the time, I think.
Absolutely. And this interview is one example of that. So follow along with us at Upside FM on Twitter. Jay is at @JKlaus and I am at EK Hornung. Enough plugging. Let's get into the interview. What do you think, Jay?
Yeah, let's talk to John. Please enjoy this interview with John Fein of Firebrand Ventures. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be so plugged in and, dare I say, integral to the Kansas City startup ecosystem?
Sure. So I'm not originally from Kansas City. I'm originally from Boston, Massachusetts. I actually grew up in a town called Brookline, which is right next to Boston. I went to college outside Boston, and then after college, and I had majored in psychology and learned soon thereafter that just was not the field for me. You know, maybe I didn't have the mental fortitude for that field. So I gravitated towards something I always knew and was comfortable with, which was technology. My dad had worked for Digital Equipment Corporation, and we had a computer terminal, not a PC, an actual mainframe terminal in the house. And so I was on that thing from the time I was 8 or 9 years old. I got into technology and actually ended up moving to California about a year after I graduated college. And it was an awesome experience. I was in San Diego for 15 years, and that covered the time of the dot-com boom and bust. And so during that time, I was fortunate to experience that not only in Southern California, but Northern as well. I was a part of 5 different startups during that time, and 2 of them had headquarters in the Bay Area. So, you know, it was a crazy, crazy time, and it was a great thing to experience on both sides of the bubble. You know, one of those startups I co-founded. So I have the whole founder experience of, you know, raising money and grinding out product development and getting customers and the whole 9 yards. None of those 5 startups were hugely successful by any stretch. A couple were moderately, I would say. And then what happened was I ended up, our son was born in 2003. And shortly thereafter, I said, you know, I should probably get just a normal job for a while and take a break after having worked for 5 startups back to back. And so I got a job with a company at the time that was called Prescription Solutions. And they were sort of at the forefront of the mail order pharmacy business, sending prescriptions through the mail. They had outgrown their facility in San Diego, and they hired me to spin up their new operation in Kansas City. And so I joined them in 2005, and that's what brought me out here. I was traveling out here all the time. I loved it. I think we were ready for a change. I mean, Southern California is amazing. I miss a lot of things about living there, but it had gotten, you know, a lot more crowded and expensive than it was when we first moved there. And I think we were ready for a change. And so I relocated my family here in 2006, and that's what brought me here. And the interesting thing was I wasn't engaged with the startup community at that time when I moved here. And there wasn't much of a startup community at that time. I think I was working for a big company. You know, we had gotten acquired by United Health Group right around the time I relocated to KC, which is also kind of when the fun stopped, because my first project for them in spinning up this operation in Kansas City was building an operation I was responsible for from 0 to 1,500 employees over 4 years, and from 0 to about $2 billion a year in revenue over that same time span. And so that was my life. You know, I wasn't in the startup world. I was managing these large projects for United. But, you know, as it often goes, after we were acquired by a large corporation, it got to be a lot less entrepreneurial and a lot more bureaucratic. And some people are perfectly okay in that environment. I'm definitely not one of them. So I started engaging with the startup community a few years after we were acquired by United States, probably like 2011, 2012. And I felt like I was, again, very lucky. That's when the startup community here, at least at KC, really started to take off. Google Fiber had come in. So, the neighborhood where Google Fiber was first installed in the United States is in Kansas City, in a place that became known as the Kansas City Startup Village. So even though you might think having a lot more bandwidth isn't a huge catalyst, it actually was a big spark for our community. So that's a long-winded way of telling you how I got to KC and how I started to engage.
So let me just get the timelines right. 2006, you came to Kansas City. 5 years later, in 2011, you left this company that you were working with. It's 2011. You start getting involved in the Kansas City startup ecosystem in its early days. What has changed between 2011 and 2018 in Kansas City? Because what I see now is that Kansas City is really blossoming and doing a lot of incredible stuff.
Absolutely. And I actually stayed with United Health Group right up until the time I joined Techstars as managing director. So I actually stayed with them through 2013. So it was a really interesting experience. I was working for United and I was attending startup events and meeting people in the startup community. And it was kind of like two completely different worlds. So many things have changed for Kansas City since that time. I think it happens in steps, right? Like it doesn't happen overnight. Brad Feld's famous book, Startup Communities, he talks about it's roughly like a 20-year life cycle to develop a real self-sustaining startup ecosystem. And, I think Kansas City is 5 to 6 years into that. So I think that, what happens is you start to have successes, entrepreneur-led successes. So for Kansas City, it's companies like iVerify that was acquired by Alibaba / Ant Financial, for $100 million a couple of years ago. It's C2FO, who raised a round of $100 million last year or earlier this year, I think it was. So it's been those types of steps on the entrepreneur side and the startup side. And then it's been sort of little validation points that, every startup ecosystem seems to have. So it's everything from, Uber coming into your town and Lyft. We have a WeWork now. Techstars came in 2013. We have, a real smart city organization that was actually one of the 7 finalists that lost to you guys in Columbus. So kudos to Columbus for getting that, for sure.
Love it.
And so I think that it's been a progression, of these little milestones that, each successive milestone sort of adds more excitement and credibility and vibrancy to the community. I think most importantly, it creates a cohesiveness around the startup ecosystem where it becomes easier and easier for founders to find each other, to find capital, to find customers. And, so I think Kansas City's on its way, but like I said, probably 5 or 6 years into that 20-year cycle. So definitely a ways to go as well.
So when you say Techstars came in and you were the managing director, that was of the Sprint Accelerator, right?
That's right.
And thinking back now, we may have crossed paths because I was with the Startup Weekend Americas Summit that went to Kansas City in 2013 or 2014 to the Sprint Accelerator. What number branded accelerator was that for Techstars? I think it's probably one of the first, right?
It was early on. I think it was somewhere between, as far as active programs, somewhere between like 10 and 12 at the time. They started with their city programs, which they refer to as the programs that are not affiliated with a corporate partner. Those are all the big cities, most of them in the US. And then they started bringing on other corporate partners and experimenting with that model. And now they really refined it. And I think they have it's almost 45 programs now around the world. It's crazy how much they've grown. So it was pretty early days for Techstars. The cool part for me, selfishly, was that when I started engaging with them, it's actually a cool story because I'd been engaged with the Kansas City Startup community for, probably roughly about a year and a half. I didn't reach out to Techstars. They reached out to me through a contact I had met in the community here in Kansas City. So basically what happened is I got an email from David Cohen out of the blue. So I was like, why is David Cohen sending me an email? I don't understand this. This is pretty awesome. To, me flying to Boulder for a day. And that team at the time still being relatively small enough where I basically met everybody, all the the key people in Boulder there in a day, had lunch with David Cohen. And at the time before I went, I had not envisioned like running an accelerator program. That just didn't seem to be the next step in my career path. I thought I was going to, start another startup. But after I met the Techstars team, I was completely sold. I went from like on the fence to, I got to get this job. These are amazing people. Even after having transitioned from Techstars to Firebrand, I still feel the same way about them. So it was great to join Techstars at that stage where it was still relatively small, definitely felt like a startup themselves, and just incredible people there.
You mentioned Firebrand. Can you talk to us about that transition from Techstars to Firebrand and why the creation of Firebrand? What was the impetus behind that?
Yeah, the creation of Firebrand was really a direct result of the experience I had at Techstars, which was, I'm sure you guys probably know, Techstars takes applications from startups from all over the world. And so every year, even here in Kansas City, we had a really diverse, broad application pool. And what I saw was once we, selected those 10 companies, for the first 2 years, by the way, we didn't have any companies from Kansas City. And we didn't have a lot of companies even from the Midwest. It just worked out that way. But what they all had in common was they were all building real businesses, and they all raised $0 from Kansas City, and in most cases, $0 from the Midwest. And so I took a step back after 2 years of doing that and seeing that, and said, wait a minute, okay, what's going on? Is this something they're doing wrong? Is this something I'm doing wrong? Is this something that is just fundamentally lacking in the investment community? And most of the answer I came up with was the last one. And so I just felt like it shouldn't be that difficult to raise an early seed round in the Midwest. But I just felt like this region was missing deals, and worse, a lot of cases, the startups were leaving and they were going to the coasts. And so that was the real impetus to start Firebrand after that third year.
What type of feedback did you get from the community when you started that?
Yeah, huge support. I can go on and on about the people of Kansas City, and I'm rocking the Love KC shirt. It just nothing but support. It was amazing. In fact, so the story goes, I had not raised $1 for the fund when I announced it, which was a sort of risky, calculated, decision to just trying to get the word out to people that this is what I'm doing. And again, just just so much support from different corners of the community. And what ended up happening was, what that turned into was 99.5% of the LPs in my fund are here in Kansas City. So, I couldn't have asked for anything more. There was one of the first contacts I had in the high net worth community, who's a gentleman who's very, very well connected and a great connector. He doesn't need to do any of these things. He just loves to grow the community. And I went to him and I said, I'm thinking about raising like $1 million in Kansas City and then going outside for the rest. And he said, no. He's like, forget that. You're going to raise the whole thing here. I can make some connections for you, get the ball rolling. This is what you're going to do. I said, okay, if you're willing to do that, let's do it. And so that's what ended up happening. It was great.
And how much did you end up raising?
So the goal was to raise $7 million for the fund and have it just be a small, first time seed fund. And we ended up raising a little under 18. So, and again, it was vast majority of Kansas City investors. So it was, it went well. It wasn't easy. It shouldn't be easy, I think, but it turned out really well.
We both read your recent blog post talking about your lessons in raising this fund, and it was such a great read. So thank you for being transparent and sharing that. What types of companies do you think could succeed in Kansas City? And if you want to extrapolate to the Midwest generally, go ahead and do that. But where do you think Kansas City or the Midwest really provides fertile ground?
Yeah, the great thing about the Midwest is that each community has sort of its own value to add for companies, and it's not necessarily limiting as far as Detroit, obviously, mobility, but you don't have to be a mobility startup to succeed in Detroit. Cincinnati with consumer/CPG, same thing. Indianapolis with MarTech, but they have grown enough so that if you are in that sector, that's awesome, and you're going to get a lot of resources. But even if you're not, that's okay too. For Kansas City, it used to be ag/animal health. There's an organization in Kansas City that a lot of people outside KC or the ag industry don't know about. It's called the Animal Health Corridor. And so Kansas City is like the animal health capital, possibly of the world, definitely of the US. So the majority of sales of pet food, diagnostics, and animal pharma originate from companies that are based in Kansas City. And most people don't know that. It's a like a group of over 100 animal health companies that are here. obviously, if you're in that sector, this is a great place to be. But we have an awesome fintech community that has been outstanding. I mentioned a company called C2FO that raised 100 million in their last round. We also have a company called Bloom, which is sort of a high-tech 401k platform that's geared a lot towards millennials. They're doing extremely well. In fact, there's a fintech accelerator that just popped up. My friends at NBKC Bank just launched an accelerator specifically for fintech. So it's really quite diverse in KC. We've invested in 4 KC companies. They're all different. Logistics is obviously another big area for Kansas City. Kansas City obviously has a pedigree based on transportation. Awesome. Central location for that, and a lot of great transportation companies to partner with. It's great. The diversity of the sectors really make it special, I think.
Are you guys still a seed fund, even though you raised almost or a little more than double what you were projecting?
Yeah, definitely seed. Our sweet spot is investing in rounds when a startup is raising, somewhere between 500K and 2 million is typically when we'll invest. I really look up to, because you see other funds out there where they start off as a seed fund and then they raise a bigger and bigger and bigger, and they get into Series A very relatively quickly in their succession of funds that they raise. And I really look up to, other funds like Homebrew as an example. They've raised slightly larger funds each time, but they've really stayed true to the seed phase because that's really what it is these days. In fact, Hunter Walk wrote a great blog post about how it's a phase, not a round anymore. So I think there's still tons of opportunity in seed, and that's just where I'm personally most comfortable. I kind of learned it at Techstars more than anywhere else, investing at that early stage. And so it's where I have the most fun, and it's hopefully where I had a little bit of value as well.
How do you go about adding value? I know that some people have like pillars of how they add value as a VC. What are your pillars, or however you think about it?
Yeah, I treat it very similarly to how I worked with startups when I was at Techstars. So sometimes it's sort of part investor, part mentor, and 100% partner. Our whole approach at Firebrand is treat us like a partner in your journey. And we use the word journey on purpose because we've been founders, and I have an amazing advisory board that includes people like David Cohen, Wendy Lee, Brian McClendon, who created Google Earth and Google Maps, and just some amazing people that have all been founders. And so there's a lot of empathy there and knowledge that this is not going to be a straight upward line. This is going to be a crazy ride. And there's going to be twists and turns and mistakes and ups and downs. And we want the founders to know that we're there. We've been there and we're there for them. And we're going to help not just when the times are good, but hopefully more than anything when the times are bad. And if they can trust us to confide in us, we're not going to judge them or lord over them or anything like that. We're going to roll up our sleeves and solve it for them. Mike Maples used a great term called co-conspirator. He sees himself as like a co-conspirator with his startup founders. And I really relate to that. So that's the approach we really love to take and the value we add. Each startup is different, needs different things. And yes, I tend to spend a little bit more time with our earlier stage founders than later stage. So it can be anything from strategy advice, making connections for anything they need from customers to new hires, to just being there for that midnight call or text message when everything's hitting the fan, and they just need an ear, right? They need a sounding board. So that's what we want to be for them.
So with Kansas City being in your estimated year 5 or 6 of this 20-year journey, help me project forward and think about what needs to continue to grow in Kansas City for the next decade plus.
Yeah, I know. I'd say recently there's some awesome progress in just the quantity and quality of startups that are in this community. It used to be that everybody knew everybody, and that's not the case anymore. I was just having this conversation yesterday with I don't know if you guys have read Startland News. It's like the main startup publication in KC. And they're themselves are a great connector, and they hold events from time to time. And we were just talking yesterday about how even as recently, probably as 3 years ago, if you attended a startup event in KC, it was the same people that went from event to event, right? And so the events were fun, but they were more just like parties, and you knew exactly who was going to be there. I attended an event the other day, and I literally probably knew a handful of people out of, the 60 or 70 people that were there. So it's grown immensely from a quantity and quality standpoint, and the sources of funding have grown as well. So just in the last few years, there's been probably 4 or 5 funds that have popped up, that have been launched and raised money and actively making investments, all sort of different approaches. So that's fantastic. It still has a ways to go in other areas. So, again, that book, Startup Communities, that Brad wrote, is so great because I always sort of come back to it in my head when I'm thinking about what Kansas City still needs to sort of cross that next milestone. Like I said, every Midwest or every startup community is different, needs different things, and has strengths and weaknesses. I'd say with Kansas City, corporate engagement is still an area where we need to improve. It's gotten a lot better over the years, especially sort of the mid-sized corporations have really engaged with the community. I'm still looking for a lot more engagement from the largest companies in Kansas City that I think would have a lot to offer. And then also, just there's always room for improvement in engagement with the universities. There's some fantastic universities, some right in Kansas City, some, a 40-minute drive from Kansas City like KU, that have huge pools of talent. I think we all need to, just do whatever we can to have a two-way engagement with them to really create a nice talent feeder into the ecosystem. It's happening a little bit, but I would love to see it happening more. And just, how it goes, right? It's awareness, and it's making, faculty and students aware of their opportunities in the startup community. And, these days, Kansas City is like everywhere else, like everybody's hiring. Every startup is hiring. A lot of startups are raising money and growing. And so a lot of that is just making sure that we have a talent feeder system locally.
One last question from me, John. When a startup that's early stage comes to you and they're asking you just for advice and saying, we're about to raise a seed round or even a Series A, what type of advice do you give those founders in Kansas City?
Yeah, I think the thing that's overlooked here, like anywhere else sometimes, is the building of relationships. And so the first thing I tell them is, don't wait until you absolutely need to start raising. Start engaging with people now. Get warm introductions to people. Grab coffee with them. Get to know them as well as, let them get to know you and your vision for your company. I think that's super, super important. More important than anything else. Everything comes back to relationships. And so I think specifically, even for Midwest communities, it's even more important. I think things happen with a lot more velocity sometimes on the coasts. Here, it seems to be a longer process of building trust. And so again, it's just that much more important to build those relationships.
Great. Well, thanks so much for being on the show, John. I want to be respectful of your time here. If people want to learn more about you or Firebrand, where would you direct them?
Yeah. Check out our website, reach out to me on Twitter. I'm probably most active on Twitter than anything else. Accessibility is a big part of our approach. And so, I welcome anybody who wants to reach out to me. Our mission in life is to connect with and invest in exceptional founders. And so always looking for those and always happy to help wherever I can.
Great. Thanks so much for being on the show. All right, Eric, we just talked with John Fein of Firebrand Ventures. Hot take. What did you think of that conversation?
I'm going to give you a lukewarm take. No, I'm just kidding. The one thing that I took away that I think was alluded to or talked about, but we didn't really dive into it, was this idea that when John went to raise Firebrand, there was this guy, this mystery man, who said, absolutely not, you're not raising only $1 million here, you're going to raise the entire thing here. Like, that kind of advocacy, we need to find people like that, Jay. That is like, I just thought that was so amazing, and we didn't really dive deeper into how this guy was connected, why he was such an advocate for Kansas City and the Kansas City startup scene. But I love that. I love that.
Yeah, true. I think you and I find all the time that so much of life is just the people, right? And getting connected to the right people, and not just right people in terms of how can this person help me, but the right people in terms of who are the people that are aligned with my way of thinking and can really align with me and enroll with me on this journey that I'm going on for whatever it is. Similarly, a lot of the takeaways I had in this interview are actually similar to the takeaways I had from the blog post that John wrote that we both talked about and mentioned, the lessons from running a micro VC. He said his goal for raising the round for Firebrand, his initial goal for investment was $7 million. And that number stuck out to me because, Eric, you and I have talked about what a minimally viable micro VC fund would be, and the figure we've kind of come to was $7 million.
Yeah, it's funny. I think that there's these kind of just like truths out there, and people generally kind of center around them. It's like, okay, you want to raise a micro VC, what's the minimum? It's 7 million. It's like, I've seen it time and time again, and it is. I thought the exact same thing when he first said that.
Well, and that wasn't our first thought. Our first thought for a while was like, well, what it looked like to be 500K. And then it was like, okay, well, what about if it was $1 million? Well, what if it was 3 million? You know, you have Spearhead out there who offers up to $1 million for their cohort of angel investors that they're trying to train. We looked at 3 to 5, but the problem with that seemed to be you wouldn't have much capital to deploy in terms of follow-on investment. It seemed like the math that we were doing and the people that we were talking to who had been involved in small VC or micro VC, that kind of pointed us to this $7 million number. So you have some on reserve that you can follow on with some of the bets that you took that were winning and doing well. Also, though, on that note, $7 million was his initial goal, but he ended up raising a little under 18 million. And then he went on to say, actually, fundraising is never really done. Still fundraising. And I thought that was an interesting take too, because I had kind of been of the mind that you raise a fund, you deploy the fund. Eventually, sure, you're going to go back and fundraise, but I didn't think of it in terms of sort of a perpetual fundraise.
Yeah. And he mentioned that in terms of him, but also in terms of founders, you are continuously getting your story out there, because when it does come time that you need to, put the pedal to the metal, you want to have those relationships in place. So it's like, okay, I want to raise fund 2. Well, I've been talking to people for 2 years about the potential for fund 2 already. Same with a founder. If I want to, fundraising isn't a set point in time. It's a continuous relationship building exercise.
It's also, and this is a nod to the new Drive Capital podcast, Differential. They were talking with the founder of Root Insurance, which was here in Columbus, Ohio, is here in Columbus, Ohio. And Alex Tim, the CEO of Root, was talking about their Series B. When he began raising the Series B, it was not because they needed capital. It was because investors were coming to them saying, I want to invest in your company. And I would imagine that's true for micro VC or, larger VCs who have had some success in the past. Eventually, if you're doing really well, the market flips and people are trying to give you money. And that seemed to be a little bit of the case here in John's case, where people kept showing interest, and the number rose from 7 million to 18 million, which is exciting for him.
Yeah, it is. And I think that kind of plays into the idea that he hinted at from Hunter Walk of Homebrew of how it's not rounds anymore, it's phases. And I wish we would have asked a couple more questions about that and his interpretation of it. I've seen Hunter Walk mention that before.
Something else that stuck out to me about what John was sharing in this interview, he made similar points to something we've talked about here on the podcast, which is geography. You don't need to be inside the valley to start these companies. And not only is it more cost friendly to be outside of the valley, but a lot of these ecosystems have very specific value to add. He mentioned Detroit with mobility, Kansas City with agricultural and animal health, Cincinnati with consumer packaged goods. So for a lot of companies, it makes sense to be outside of the valley for very strategic reasons, not even just from economic reasons. And, that's just a common refrain we keep hearing. And even though it may be getting trite as much as we talk about it, we got to keep beating that dead horse and pointing to it, because it's an important aspect of starting a company outside of the valley.
Did you really just use beating that dead horse after we just learned that Kansas City is the animal health center of America and the world? Really beating that dead horse. That's the route you decided to go down.
Beat the dead horse until a startup in Kansas City can help revive said horse.
Did you know that about Kansas City, though? The animal health corridor?
No, I didn't. And actually, if you would have said which city in the Midwest is the animal health corridor of the United States, I would have guessed Iowa City.
Why? Why is that?
Bias. I've been to Iowa City. I did a startup weekend event there, and I talked to some of the founders, and I know that one of the startups we looked potentially bring on the show, won't name them, was in Iowa City, and it was related to animal health. So on a data point of 1, I would have made that snap judgment that was not Kansas City.
Yeah, that's why, you got to have a statistically relevant sample size, Jay. One thing that I wanted to mention is just the stickiness of Kansas City. I think that you and I have talked about this city before, and actually, over a year ago, we both stayed in Kansas City on our way up to the Berkshire Hathaway shareholders meeting. But I thought that it was awesome that John made the move to Kansas City and then felt the gravitational pull there. That kind of speaks to the stickiness of once you make a decision to come somewhere. And maybe it's having a family, maybe it's some outside things as well. But he found an opportunity in Kansas City, was able to apply the skills, and also caught the wave up, which started in 2011 or so.
That's such a common thing we hear for many cities in the Midwest. It's something that I hear from people who relocate to Columbus. And I think as someone outside that city, it's easy to be like, yeah, really though? Like, really? But it's true for people who go to those cities and experience it. I'm sure if I had gone to Kansas City instead of Columbus, in some ways I would have found a way to identify with that city and maybe grab onto that same gravitational pull that John was talking about. Could be true of Detroit. When I talk to people who would join VFA or go check out Detroit, that's true for a lot of them. I think that there's just a lot of benefit and good lifestyles to be lived here in the middle of the country where people are a little bit, I don't want to say rooted in reality, but in some ways, you know, you're near a more representative sample of your customers and what most people in the market kind of operate like.
One of the things that how I would differentiate my experience living in New York and living in Ohio is that everyone who lives in New York has a game plan for when they're going to get out of New York.
Interesting.
And I think it's a little opposite in Ohio. It's the place that you boomerang back to. Even if you aren't from there, you know, if you are one of your friends who came to Columbus, it's like, yeah, I don't have any time frame for leaving here. Whereas in New York, it's like there are people who are like, yeah, I'm doing exactly 8 years here, and then I'm leaving to go X, Y, and Z.
Wow. I was just in New York City with my mom, as you know, and I couldn't get over the fact that everyone I saw on the train looked so much more unhappy than I'm used to seeing. Like, and it wasn't like angry or mad. It just seemed like they were like beaten down. And that's a hot take. By the way,
the city can do that to you.
I don't want to let this go too long before I make this comment. When we stayed in Kansas City on our way to Berkshire, I distinctly remember thinking of Kansas City as the nicest Midwest nice that I had ever experienced.
Really? Have you been to Minneapolis?
Actually, good point. Yes. But I was in Minneapolis to see a Green Bay Packers versus Minnesota Vikings game, and I was a Green Bay fan. So probably tainted my experience a little bit. But the two things that happened in Kansas City when we were there, and we were there for like, 12 hours? Less than 24 hours.
Yeah.
One, I was taking out the trash of the woman who was hosting us, and somebody on a morning jog literally stopped her morning jog, took out her headphones, and asked me how my morning was going as I was taking out this trash. That was number one. Number two, we were looking for a record store, and these guys who were just out on their smoke break seemed like they would move a mountain to help us find an open record store. It was crazy. Anyway.
Yeah. So if you're from New York and you're sick of the middle fingers and honking, move to Kansas City. There you go. There's the pitch. All right, Jay. We are going to wrap it up here. It was an awesome conversation. You want to run people through how to connect with us?
Yeah, totally. So if you guys enjoy this conversation, would love to hear what your takeaways were. We didn't touch on this, but I'd love to hear your take on John announcing his venture fund before he had raised a single dollar. That's like a crazy thing that we could dive into for a while. Love that. Anyway, if you guys have any thoughts, tweet at us at UpsideFM. You can also comment on this episode on Breaker. Breaker is our preferred podcasting app. Otherwise, if you guys have any thoughts, if you know somebody who could be a good guest for our show, if you could be a good guest for our show, feel free to email us as well. hello@upside.fm.
I'm here again with Casey Allen, the founder of the Enterprise Rising Conference. Casey, what is your favorite piece of feedback that you've heard over the years about Enterprise Rising?
One thing founders give me a ton of feedback on every single year, now that we've done this 5 years, is the talk in which I bring a founder up on stage whose startup crashed and burned, and they deconstruct why they think it crashed and burned, what went wrong, and what they might have done differently. And these are often very high-profile founders who had everything going for themselves, but they still couldn't quite turn the corner. And so those are the kind of talks that, quite honestly, founders give me a ton of feedback on. They loved it. They want to hear more about that because it's really educational.
How is Enterprise Rising different this year?
If you you've ever attended an online event, you know networking sucks. Slack and Discord really just don't cut it. So we have custom built for Enterprise Rising 2020 an online platform that's like Startup Masterclass meets The Sims, where every attendee has an avatar, you're in a building, you're sitting in chairs, you're sitting in couches, you're having real video chats with the people next to you. So what we've done is we've recreated an actual virtual environment where networking happens just like it does in real life.
Casey, when is Enterprise Rising and how can people get involved?
Enterprise Rising is the end of October, the 20th and 21st. It's 2 full days. It's all online, so you can dip in and out for as much or as little as you want. Go to enterpriserising.co. That's enterpriserising.co. And you can use discount code UPSIDE to score 20% off as many tickets as you want. So discount code UPSIDE at enterpriserising.co. All the details are there. The entire conference is online. It's going to be a great time.
I don't know that I was really specific before the call, but during the call, I was like, hey, look, here's the deal. You're in the middle of raising your second fund. We're doing the same thing. We seem to be on exactly the same track.
The startup investment landscape is changing, and world-class companies are being built outside of Silicon Valley. We find them, talk with them, and discuss the upside of investing in them. Welcome to Upside.
Hello, and welcome to the Upside Podcast, the first podcast finding upside outside of Silicon Valley. I'm Jay Klaus, and I'm accompanied by my co-host, Mr. Smoke 'em if you got him himself, Eric Hornung.
If you'll notice, my voice is a little bit Bob Dylan-y today, Jay.
Why is that, Eric?
There's a little rasp. There's a little grit on this voice, a little grit on these vocal cords. Well, last night I had a couple of adult beverages, you might say.
As is your right.
Right, because I'm an adult and I can have adult beverages. I had a couple glasses of vino, and we polished those off. And maybe we didn't polish them off. Maybe we did it simultaneously with a nice. You ever smoke cigars, Jay? You ever heard of a cigar?
Yes, I've heard of a cigar. Almost never have smoked a cigar.
Since I got into golfing, I've also gotten into cigars. So there's been like a 1-to-1 correlation there.
I've never experienced like a good cigar. I feel like you smoke your first cigar in high school and it's like not even a real cigar. And then you're like, you know what? Maybe that's not for me. But what's really not for you is just like Black and Milds.
Apple Black and Milds. We had a thing in high school when we graduated called Senior Smoke Day, where every senior brought a cigar to school. Do you guys have that, or is that just
I think so. I think we definitely did like the aviators graduation gown cigar thing that most graduating seniors do.
Okay. I didn't know if that was just a thing we did or not, but yeah. So last night, if you guys are feeling a little rasp on this voice, a little bit of folky on the road grit, that's why.
Well, Eric, where there's smoke, there's Firebrand Ventures. And today we are speaking with John Fein and Chris Marks, the managing partners of Firebrand Ventures. And if you'll remember, we spoke with Firebrand Ventures and John Fein specifically back in September of 2018 as our second ever coffee chat on this show.
One of those people early on who took a risk on us when we were just a little fledgling, budding podcast, Jay. And it's awesome that we're having some of these people back on the podcast.
Great to bring John back, and specifically we're bringing him back to talk about something that we've never heard of before, because as I mentioned, we're talking with John and Chris Marks, the managing partners of Firebrand Ventures, and this happened in a unique way. But before we touch on that, let me introduce the two of them. Prior to founding Firebrand Ventures, John served as a managing director for Techstars, which is a leading startup accelerator with more than 40 programs around the world. And while at Techstars, he ran 3 accelerator programs in Kansas City, investing in 30 startups. Chris, on the other hand, was the founder and managing partner of Blue Note Ventures, an early-stage venture fund investing in great technology companies and entrepreneurs committed to authentic leadership. Now, here's where this gets interesting, Eric. Something we've never heard before. After co-investing for a few years in several companies together out of their respective funds, Chris and John realized that they not only shared a similar investment strategy, but also an underlying set of values around how they partnered with entrepreneurs. So in late 2019, they joined forces and merged Firebrand and Blue Note.
They did. They pushed them together. So when I heard about this, I immediately sent John a note on the Twitter DMs and said, congratulations. Obviously, I think this would be a really interesting topic to talk about on the podcast. So diving into this interview, for the listeners, it is very, very, very uncommon that two financial services firms, specifically venture capital firms, merge. And I'm excited to see like what that looks like.
Yeah, I've never heard of it before. I'm excited to ask them a lot of questions about it and how it worked, because it seems like there's a lot of stakeholders that are actually involved in something like this. So you'd have to get on board and do this. But you know what? It seems like John and Chris realized we only have one life to live. We might as well live that the best way that we can.
Just like our friends at Ethos Wealth Management. And if you want to learn more about Ethos Wealth Management, you can go to upside.fm/ethos.
We'll jump in here and talk with John and Chris right after this.
Let's bring in Meredith Sugar, a partner at Taft, Stettinius, and Hollister, to teach us about preparing for an exit. Taft is a full-service law firm known for assisting entrepreneurs across the heartland. As a reminder, the following remarks by Taft attorneys are for informational purposes only and are not legal advice. This information is not intended to create, and receipt of it does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. No person or organization should act upon this information without first seeking professional counsel. Meredith, thanks for coming in today. How's your day?
Good.
Meredith, I wanted to give you a hypothetical situation here. Let's say I'm a founder and there's an acquisition offer on the table. It's starting to feel very real that there'll soon be a lot of money in my bank account. So how might I, as a founder, think about estate planning services?
Well, although an acquisition certainly encourages business owners to execute estate plans, the time to have engaged in planning is yesterday, if not now, whether or not an acquisition is imminent. Avoiding the time and cost of probate is generally very easy to do by having a trust, especially for business owners. The trust will hold all that person's assets, including their business. Many other good reasons exist to have a trust. For one, a trust can keep children from inheriting at the age of 18, holding their funds in trust, even though the funds are always there for their support until ages later than 18. Tax planning is another good reason to have a trust. We currently have a very high federal estate tax exemption of over $11 million per person, but this exemption likely won't stay this high, and in the past few years it's been as low as $1 million. Passing away with more than this amount subjects a person to a 40% tax. Trusts are able to make the tax scenario as favorable as possible, and more creative types of trusts can help with wealth transfer to lessen the tax burden even more.
Something that no one thinks about, but everyone should be thinking about: taxes. Appreciate you coming on. And if people want to learn more about Taft or yourself, where should they go?
Our law firm website is taftlaw.com, and I can be found on the site.
John, great to have you back. Chris, great to have you here.
Great to be back.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks.
We have had the John Fein experience on the podcast before, but Chris, you're new to the podcast. We'd love to start with you and Blue Note. Can you tell us about a history of Chris?
Sure. Happy to do that. So I'm in Boulder, Colorado, and I've been doing early stage venture investing here for going on almost 20 years now. You know, it was about 5 years ago that I got a little bit disillusioned with what I was doing in venture and decided to set out and start my own fund. That became Blue Note Ventures. Blue Note Ventures was a seed stage capital fund that focused heavily on the type of entrepreneur we backed. We were looking for what we deemed authentic leaders, which were people who were trying to create cultures of real transparency, and we were trying to model that in our own behavior as we interacted with these companies. So that was Blue Note Ventures. We invested in 13 portfolio companies, all early stage. We were kind of tech generalists looking to invest in the Rocky Mountain region, but also just anywhere between the coasts, and still managed that portfolio, and was just, you know, it was kind of starting that fund is really when I crossed paths with John and when we got to know each other.
Usually when I get disenchanted with something, I don't go and then do that thing again. What were you like disenchanted with in the venture space, but not disenchanted enough that you went and started your own?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, it was kind of a series of events that, you know, I've been doing it for a while and had invested. You know, venture capital has a a bit of a reputation for being having some not so great elements to it in terms of, I guess, competition for deals, competition among venture capitalists. And I just had a couple bad experiences, just in terms of investing in people that, let me put it this way, it was a bit of a pattern. We'd find a company, we'd get to know them, we'd invest in them, everything would be great, the world would be great, they'd be crushing it, and then one day the bottom would fall out, and I'd get the call of, oh my gosh, we have 30 days until we hit a wall, or oh my gosh, this has been going on internally, we haven't talked about it. And what I came to realize, it was really the dynamic between investor and entrepreneur that is kind of inevitable in the venture world. So I just took a step back and said, is this something I want to do, or could I do it differently? And that was the impetus behind Blue Note Ventures, was just an attempt to kind of do it differently, both in the type of people I invested in and the way I communicated with them. And I kind of figured the best way to do it was on the very front of any relationship to say, hey, this is going to be a little different. I'm going to be really authentic with you and really open with you. And that's the way this relationship needs to be for it to work. And, some entrepreneurs were excited about that. Some found it refreshing, and some kind of ran the other way. So we self-selected in terms of who we invested in. We self-selected in terms of the LPs that kind of backed that strategy. And we self-selected in terms of the, other funds that we co-invested with. And so it was a bit of an experiment, not only from an investment strategy, but also just, hey, how to make life better as a venture capitalist. I think it's worked on both fronts.
So it sounds like what you're describing, Chris, is that in a lot of the venture space, you were experiencing founders who didn't feel comfortable expressing the challenges they were facing or the things that weren't going so well to their capital partners in real time. It was waiting until it was really an issue that they couldn't ignore anymore.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the traditional venture relationship is one that says, as an entrepreneur, and many of these people are first-time CEOs or first-time founders, and they're thinking, well, geez, if these people have enough confidence in me to give me their money, then I should probably have all the answers to all the questions. And it right out of the gate, it creates this bad dynamic in terms of a relationship where you're maybe not getting the truth. And if you don't know the problems as an investor, you can't help, obviously. So yeah, that's absolutely the kind of fundamental disconnect we were trying to solve for.
You also mentioned that when you started socializing that to founders, some of them ran the other direction. Why do you think some founders would not want that?
Well, the truth can always be a little bit scary, right? And different people are looking for different things in their investors. I think some people would rather just take the capital and say, we'll check in with you on a quarterly basis and let you know how it's going. And others are really looking for partners in the trenches who are willing to roll up their sleeves and help and get into the nitty gritty and kind of help them solve the day-to-day problems. That's the partner we wanted to be, and we were very open about it. So if it wasn't a good fit up front, then we really appreciated companies opting out. And maybe run the other way is a bit of a strong statement, but it's all about finding the right match in venture, between investor and entrepreneur. So we were just trying to be a little bit more open and selective on that front.
John, obviously, we know a little bit about this story of the two of you coming together. We'll get into it here in a second, but I know a big part of that was because you guys shared similar values. So what were you seeing, John, or what kind of brought you to the same realization that you wanted to operate Firebrand in the same way?
So, a lot of what I learned as a professional investor, or I guess that sort of started to serve as the foundation for my approach as a professional investor were my experiences running the Techstars program in Kansas City over 3 years. And because one of the wonderful things about being a managing director for a Techstars program is the volume of founders that you get to interact with. So in any given year, you're probably interacting with, upwards of 1,000 startups just to get to the selection process for your program. And so those learnings that I had selecting founders for those programs and interacting with those founders and sort of trying to check myself and also leveraging my own mentors to sort of just figure out, are these founders the right fit? Or do they have the things that we're looking for? Going back to a couple of things that Chris said, like, are they authentic, right? Is there a high level of integrity? Do their values match, what we're going for? with these programs. And so I think that's where it started for me, is when or at least that's when I really started thinking about it. And sort of my journey through Techstars and all the learnings that I had through those 3 years sort of formed the basis of that investment approach with Firebrand.
So, John, you were starting Firebrand about the same time in 2016. I'm actually going to turn this around to both of you, whoever wants to go first. When did you first meet one another?
It was in 2016, and I'm sure it was on one of my trips to Boulder. It may have been like a lunch at the St. Julian. Like, I forget exactly where it was. It was somewhere in downtown Boulder in 2016. And I do remember the reason we met was because I had reached out to the Techstars Boulder program, and I was like, hey, give me a list of your top Boulder VCs, like who are just not just investors, but like who are the good people I need to meet in the investment community? Because even though I had a decent network there, it wasn't as a fund manager. And so I think that's where Chris's name sort of bubbled to the top, and I think that's when we first met.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I remember that lunch pretty clearly because we were both in the process of raising our respective first funds. I think I was a little further down the road, but you were just getting underway. And I was struck at that lunch. I'd certainly heard about John through the Techstars network, and I'd been a mentor in the Boulder program for a long time. But I just remember at that lunch, I mean, oftentimes when two VCs meet for the first time and they have lunch, it can be a little bit guarded. But I do recall at that lunch, we both kind of commiserated over the process, had some good laughs over some of the people we were pitching and how it had gone. And so, yeah, I do remember leaving that lunch thinking, got to keep in touch with John. This is going to be helpful.
I like to fast forward a bit because you guys obviously did keep in touch, and now you're merged two venture capital firms. But as you were going through that process of deciding we have a lot in common, we launched our funds around the same time. We both asked different questions. John, you might not know this, but we had Johan on from InKind, and he said the thing that really stuck out to him about you was your first question wasn't like about the fund. It was about how many hours of sleep he got at night, and you were hoping that he was exercising. I feel like you guys come at venture from a different way from that first question, that first conversation. But how did you think about, and it's easy to find similarities between people, how did you think about the differences between you and how those would work together in a potential partnership or merger?
The great part about, this process of sort of Chris and I coming together in the same fund is that we had 4 companies that we co-invested in together, Firebrand and Blue Note. And I think it was, through those co-investment experiences where, just naturally, because we already had a relationship or we had a building relationship, we would compare notes, we would talk every so often. There were 1 or 2 companies where we were like right on the same track, it seemed like, in terms of our decision-making process from a timing standpoint. And so I think that really helped, define in my own mind, like, hey, like first it was like, wow, we have a lot in common, like just as far as our outlook towards what we look for in founders, how we work with companies, and sort of the investment decision-making process. But also, I think what you said is the differences are really important as well. I should say, like, I would say our overall style is very similar, but we come from different backgrounds, right? Like Chris has more years of experience as an investor than I do, and he has it in a variety of different types of funds, and he has a legal background. So I don't have any of that. I was a founder, I was a startup person, an operator, and then, I eventually made my way to Techstars and then Firebrand. And so I think those different types of backgrounds really help just bring, different perspectives to the table. I don't think either one of us would want to have done this if, we felt like we were exactly the same and always brought the same things to the table, because that's really not, that's not too helpful in a team environment.
Yeah, and although we did 4 deals together in our respective first funds, we looked at several deals that one of us would do and the other wouldn't. So it was obvious from the start that we had some different views on investing. And I think from my perspective, as we were kicking around the idea of joining forces, one of the things that was attractive to me is that in this business, it's so easy. I mean, some people call it pattern recognition as a good thing, but it's also kind of falling into your own biases as an investor. And one of the things that was attractive to me was having, I guess a different set of biases, a different set of experiences. It's just a healthy way to go. And I think it's broadened our investment horizon overall, by combining those.
The other thing I would add is that nothing ever goes perfectly. And, we all have our failures and our lessons that we've learned along the way. And naturally, we're going to have different types of lessons. And I think that's much more important than whatever successes that we've had in our past. And so I think just having different types of struggles and failures and lessons learned from those things are hugely important.
How important was the overall timing of this? And it seemed like both of you are going into a second fund. Was timing a big factor here for other venture firms that may want to merge in the future? Like, is there good timing or bad timing?
Well, yeah, ours worked out on a lot of levels. First and foremost, the fact that we got it done before the pandemic hit is something we're thankful for overall. But in terms of where we were as two firms, I think it was really helpful. I don't know if it's impossible to merge if you're at different stages, but we just happened to be at a point where we had both gone through an initial close, largely with our existing LPs from our first fund. We had closed but not called any capital. So it's a very unique position. We had gotten commitments, people had signed the paperwork, but we hadn't called any capital, we hadn't made any investments. And as a result, we were kind of starting with a clean balance sheet. So it was fortunate. I think it definitely sped the process up. I mean, we started talking about it around Thanksgiving of last year. And, despite the holidays and everything else, we closed right at the end of January. So it was a fairly quick process. And it really involved us, first of all, making the decision amongst ourselves it was something we wanted to do, and then going back to our LPs and kind of laying out the bigger vision and getting them on board. So all of that, considered, it went very quickly.
What was that first around Thanksgiving conversation like? Was it a, hey, what if? Or was it a, I have a very formal plan and let's do this?
I called Chris. I was on my way to the airport in Kansas City, and I called him from my car, and I just threw it out there. I just got right to it because I think I was cryptic. I was like, hey, I want to talk to you about something before that. And I don't know that I was really specific before the call, but during the call, I was like, hey, look, here's the deal. You're in the middle of raising your second fund. We're doing the same thing. We seem to be on exactly the same track. It was always on my agenda to have, two partners in our second fund. And that was the first conversation. And it was like, okay, it was really just throwing it out there for initial thought. And then it just sort of went from there. And we continued to have follow-up conversations. And like Chris said, it went pretty quickly, given the fact that it started in late November and we got it done in, I guess, officially in January, but I think really it was done a little bit before that. So yeah, the timing was, so I still look back and I was like, wow, this is like lightning in a bottle. Like, I don't know if this is ever going to happen again, just because of how everything lined up.
Chris, when he sent you a text that said, hey, I want to talk to you about something, were you like, uh-oh? Or were you like, I'm excited?
No, I was always, one of the things I appreciate about John is he's pretty direct. So I knew when I got the message that he wanted to chat that it was probably something on his mind that was timely. So, I was not in my cards to have a second partner for my second fund. I was kind of committed to, the model seemed to be working for me as a sole GP. I had certainly had my reservations going into the first fund, but by the time the second fund rolled around, I was feeling more confident. And, having gone through the fundraising process, I was ready to kind of put that behind me. But John, as he said, he was fairly direct, and he basically said, look, I'm not necessarily looking for a partner. I'm not talking to anyone else, but if you're interested, I think we should explore this. As much as I wasn't expecting that conversation, it really didn't come as that much of a surprise because it just felt very natural from the start. And I remember getting off the phone with John. I was working from home that day and I came upstairs and I told my wife about it, and she's like, wow, it sounds like this is something you want to do. And I was like, yeah, it kind of does. Huh. It just it just I mean, we obviously questioned it and went through the process and spent a lot of time together and all of that. But it really, from the start, felt very natural.
Something that comes up a lot of times in conversations with investors, they'll talk about how nice it is to have co-investors and kind of co-collaborators. And you guys were obviously that for a period of a couple of years. But sometimes also they'll talk about how competitive deal making is. So when you're going into this arrangement, did this feel like you were potentially losing a co-investor, or did this feel like you were losing a competitor? How did you think about that?
I'd never even thought about that. That didn't even cross my mind. And there's so many funds. There's so many seed funds out there. It's funny because that is true. Like, I guess we did lose a great co-investor, but because we're combining or have already combined, we can put a lot more power behind the investments that we make. So, just bigger funds, larger checks. That's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought of it. I'd never thought of us as competitors, that's for sure. And honestly, I really don't, in general, I don't feel like there's a lot of heated competition between the coasts for deals. I might be naive in thinking that way, but I think there's some. I think the biggest competition that we see between the coasts is from much larger funds who decided to start doing seed deals between the coasts that are based on the coasts. So yeah, I mean, I just looked at it as how great this combination could be, and sort of the cliche of 1 + 1 = 3, or I guess 2 + 1 = 5, since there's two of us already at Firebrand. But that's kind of how I was thinking about it. I don't know. What about you, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely thought of us as much more collaborators than competitors. When you're a sole GP, you have kind of a very small group of co-investors that you trust and you lean on for their opinions, for their diligence, that you try and bring into deals. And, John was at the top of that list. So for me, I thought immediately, wow, the opportunity to have that partnership, I saw it much more as a benefit than anything else.
When you were collaborators and you both invested in those 4 deals, you both kind of got credit for those 4 deals publicly. How do you think about assigning, like, who's a lead partner? Or is it just when you find a deal, it's Firebrand invests, it's not led by Chris or led by John?
Yeah. I think when it comes to Firebrand, and it's, as John mentioned, there's 3 of us, me and John and Miranda, we really just work as a team. So we view it a little bit differently. Our dynamic internally is that every deal that we consider, we talk about, we hash through, we compare notes. It really is more of a group think than it is one person championing a deal and trying to win over the rest of the partnership. And I know that's very common in the venture world. I've lived that dynamic before. And I think that leads to some really bad dynamics within a firm and within a partnership. So I just think it's more our personalities and the way we work and the kind of foundation of our relationship that's not the way we operate. So really we just, any deal we do is a Firebrand deal. We all stay in contact with the founders. We all serve as resources for the CEO. If we're on the board, oftentimes more than one of us will try and attend any board meeting. It's just another way that we try and kind of help the companies we work with, is to have more than one person kind of familiar with what's going on and available as a resource.
John, did you sell Miranda on this idea before you talked to Chris?
So we've always had a team mentality, and so she was looped in from the start. She had met Chris before and had a really positive interaction with him, but didn't know him as well as I did. And so it was just a matter of me. She thought it was a great idea from the start. And then we had a really accelerated process, like we talked about, once we really got serious about it. And one of the steps that we took was, I forget who visited who first. I think I may have come to Boulder first. And then Chris, later you came to Kansas City, if that's right. But so Chris came to KC, he met with both of us, and we continue to have Miranda as a key member of that process, of course. So no, I didn't have to do any selling. It was a pretty easy, organic, process. And at the end of that process, we were all going to either decide, like, does this make sense, or does it make sense to stay independent from one another?
Yeah, and I actually remember that trip to Kansas City. So I flew out there. We got barbecue that night, the three of us, which is mandatory when you go to Kansas City. And then the next day, I actually spent the entire day with Miranda, just the two of us, and just with the idea of getting to know one another, understanding, for my benefit, understanding where she was headed, what she was thinking, and vice versa. And it was a great day. And we ended up spending a lot of time talking about venture, but we also spent a lot of time kind of walking around Kansas City and touring the city and just hanging out. And at the end of the day, when we got together with John, I think, we were both feeling really good about it. And, I loved the idea of, like John said, we have different backgrounds, but there's a lot that's similar about the two of us, and having the benefit of a young woman's perspective on the team is really something I was excited about. So I think it's a great team dynamic, and that was something that was really attractive to me about the merger.
And if you guys don't mind, I'll take this opportunity to do a quick plug for Miranda's background for the listeners. So Miranda Manning is our principal. She's based here in Kansas City with me. Miranda and I have known each other for 5 years. We met when she joined our team at Techstars in 2015. So she had the benefit of, I think that was like what she calls like her first real job out of college, was working in the Techstars program, which is pretty cool. And so she worked for two programs, were my last two programs there. And then she was obviously the first hire at Firebrand. And she's been with Firebrand for over 2 years now.
At what point did you have to bring this to LPs, and what did that look like?
That's obviously a big piece of the equation in making this work. And as I mentioned, I had just closed the fundraising process. So I had, with an initial close, so I had just been out talking to all my LPs, selling them on the vision for Blue Note Ventures 2, convincing them that as a sole GP, this was the path that was right for us to go, and everything else. So it was an interesting conversation, but so that we got them involved very early. I think as soon as John and I were committed to this, that was the next round of conversations. And, from my perspective, it went remarkably well. People knew of Firebrand because they'd been a co-investor with us. And, once I laid out, the benefits of the combined entity, the ability to write bigger checks, the ability to expand our geographic footprint, the ability to create, partnership dynamics that would, from a decision-making standpoint, and the fact that neither of us have given up any control. Any decision we make as a partnership is like I said, groupthink. So it's not, and that was something we committed to from the very beginning. So I think it was relatively easy to get them on board, but that was a big piece of the equation and something that we gave a lot of thought to. And I was a little bit anxious about wading into it.
Yeah, and I was just, on my side, it was pretty easy. It was, I think once they learned about Chris's background and what he was bringing to the table, it was a fairly smooth process. Again, I think a lot of it had to do with the timing. We didn't have to do any extra work as far as, we hadn't made any investments. We hadn't called any capital out of the second fund yet. And so I think it was a real painless process for the LPs. They all, we definitely had some good questions from them. We have, a great base of LPs that are very engaged, which I'm grateful for. So they're very supportive.
How do fund economics change when you go from solo GP and the size Firebrand was to writing larger checks, and like what changes there that might not be apparent right off the bat?
Well, part of it is just having a larger fund. So fund economics are always about, returning the fund first and getting your LPs whole first. And then obviously you kind of share in the profits, and that's fund economics. And so, we're able to, a lot of benefits come with a bigger fund. As John was mentioning, we can write bigger checks. We have the ability to lead more rounds and kind of set the terms. We have a little bit more say, presumably in the syndicates that form in those rounds. So who we're co-investing with and are maybe a little bit more attractive if the deal is competitive, because we not only write bigger checks, but we reserve more capital for future rounds. So I think there's some benefits to having a larger fund. From an economic standpoint internally, it's just everything gets a little bigger, right? The hurdle to returning the fund gets a little bit bigger, but the economics get a little bit more powerful. And of course, we now have two general partners. And so, really the economics aren't that much different for us. It's more about all the kind of benefits that come along with having the partnership and being a little bit more of a lead investor and having our kind of combined experience sets.
What happens to the Fund 1 assets? Like the portfolios you had individually, are those just legacy assets that didn't come over in this merger, or are they now kind of rolled up under this new entity?
So they are, I guess you could call them legacy in the fact that we were basically done. Blue Note was already fully deployed as far as, not making any more new investments out of the first fund. We were just completing that process when Chris joined. And so, they're just, existing portfolios that we continue to manage individually for our respective first funds. And so that's, and that'll continue until the end of those fund terms. And then, of course, the second fund is still pretty new that we're managing together.
This is something that we've never heard of before and didn't find a lot of comparable experiences happening. So, Chris, especially with your depth of history in investing, what do your peers in the venture world think of this?
Yeah, I'm not sure anyone knows what to think of this, because I think, the idea of two venture firms merging is new to the industry. I mean, I think what you see more often is a partner from one firm will move to another firm, or, one firm will maybe acquire the assets of another firm, but rarely do you see this type of merger. And I think it's, so I'm not sure people know what to make of it, but I think they get that the most important part is that the partnership between myself and John is what it's going to be going forward. And I think, using the word merger has allowed us to kind of explain it and explain how it came together so organically. And I just think, one of the reasons it doesn't happen in ventures, what we've talked about, is that the timing just really has to be perfect. Otherwise, it can get pretty complicated.
Yeah. And, I think for me, the greatest part about this merger was that it was done from a position of strength for both of us. Because I think sometimes, when any two entities merge, that's always going to be the question, is why. And, for us, it was like, look, we're both in a really strong position. Our first funds were doing really well. And, our fundraising for our second funds was going really well on both sides. So that was the best part for me. It's like, we didn't have to do this. Things would have been fine, for us individually. We just felt like it would be so much more impactful for the founders, for our LPs, if we combine forces. And so to me, that was always the best part, is that it was done from that position of strength.
How did you think about the creation of this new entity? You guys are operating under Firebrand Fund 2. Did you guys arm wrestle for who kept the brand name? Did you consider creating something entirely new? How'd you work through that?
Yes, to all of the above. No, we didn't really arm wrestle, but we did consider, becoming something totally new. We considered both the existing names. At the end of the day, it was a little more practical than that. Firebrand Ventures 2, we had formed both, right? Blue Note Ventures 2 and Firebrand Ventures 2 were both operating entities. Firebrand Ventures 2 was set up to be larger. It allowed a higher level of commitment, which made it a natural selection. We liked both names, and there's something from my perspective that, Blue Note was, it was something that I was very intentional about setting up and establishing. And it was really my personal vision at that point in time for me. So there was also something that was comfortable from my perspective about leaving Blue Note Ventures as what it was and what it continues to be going forward, which was kind of my incarnation of a really intentional shift in how I approached venture and how I wanted to be seen in venture and how I wanted to do my investing. So I'm really proud of what Blue Note Ventures was, and I'm really excited to be part of Firebrand Ventures too. So that decision, it moved pretty quickly, and I was very comfortable with it from the start.
Yeah, and I would add that, we We did treat it like a true merger. I mean, and I think the best type of merger, which is, you incorporate the key elements from both entities. And so, in this case, like, we brought over a lot of sort of the messaging, the approach, the values from what Chris had been doing at Blue Note, and sort of melded them, with what we're doing at Firebrand. We hadn't, we talked about values, somewhat at Firebrand, but I never felt like I articulated that very well. And so I think, bringing Chris on board sort of, defined all of that really well. And again, adding to what we had already been sort of working on really helped a lot.
What are we not asking about this that we probably should have asked?
It's a good question. I know we've gotten a lot of questions about this.
This is called the Jay covers his ass question.
Well, one of the things we get a lot is, now that you're in a partnership, how is the decision making going, right? We both were in a situation. I mean, John worked with Miranda, but really we both started our funds as sole GPs with kind of this, sole decision making authority, essentially. And when you're investing, that's no small thing. So I get that question a lot, like, well, how is it now that you guys have to agree on everything and you have someone else? And the answer is not that exciting, which is it's really been, I'm not sure if there's, the way, like I said, the way that we've been making our decisions in terms of more of a groupthink mentality, we tend to, even though, we have different opinions and different feelings, we've consistently gotten to the same, decisions since this thing has kicked off, which has been great. And they might be slightly different decisions than we would have made on our own and individually, but the decisions feel good and they seem very well thought out. And I think it's been all a net positive from my perspective.
Do you have a preset framework for when there is conflict?
Yeah, we've talked about this quite a bit. I think the basis of that framework that we use is, like Chris mentioned before, this is not a scenario, nor do I think it will ever be a scenario where one partner or one member of the investment team is selling the other members on an investment. I realize that happens a lot in bigger funds. I realize that happens a lot in Silicon Valley. That's not our style. There's this, well-known list called the Midas list that is a list of the individual partners at VC firms that have had a lot of success for that given year. And I kind of see it as a badge of honor to never have any of us on that list because that means we're doing deal attribution. And like we mentioned before, that's just not part of our style. So our style starts with, how do we approach this as a team? How do we let each individual come to their own conclusion by being part of the evaluation process? So for example, we might have, one of us individually might have a first meeting with a startup. And then if that's looking good, they'll bring in maybe another member. And then maybe if it continues to look great, all three of us will meet. And so first of all, we're all highly engaged with the startup pretty much from the start. So it's not a situation where someone is bringing a deal to the table and all of a sudden the other two have to catch up on what this deal even means and what this team looks like. That I think is probably the most important basis for our decision-making process, because right from the start, we're all fully informed. And then, we lead with, respect for each other, to respect each other's opinions, knowing that we're not always going to agree, but we do have a framework for, okay, what happens when one disagrees or two disagrees, how are we going to handle that? And, it's worked well. And, again, I think we all have similar enough approaches to evaluating founders. So as long as our true north continues to be investing in the team first and making sure that we don't fall in love with traction, or we don't fall in love with markets, before we fall in love with the team. If it always comes back to that, then to me, there's going to be very few times where there's a fundamental disagreement about an investment.
Yeah, and along those lines, one of the things we talk about a lot is investing in teams that, like I've mentioned, are transparent and kind of create these environments of trust and attract the best people and communicate well internally. And one of the best ways we've found to do that is really to model that in our own behavior internally. So we talk a lot about that, and like John said, we try and operate with respect and trust and very open communication, and so there's not so far, and I would never foresee it, nor do I think we tolerate it, but there's none of the gamesmanship that John's referring to. It's more just how can we make the right decision here as a group.
Well, this has been awesome, guys. Great to meet you, Chris. John, thanks for coming back. If people want to learn more about you or get involved with Firebrand after the show, where should they go?
You can find both of us on Twitter. Our website is firebrandvc.com. So those are the best places to go.
Yeah, thank you, guys. I appreciate the time, and it was nice to meet both of you.
All right, Jay, we just spoke with John and Chris from the rejuvenated Firebrand Ventures. What sparked your interest?
Ooh. Well, what was interesting to me was that everything just felt like it was easier than we expected. Everything just felt like we never heard this before. We thought it was going to be something crazy, that there were a lot of hoops to jump through. And, of course, there were some hoops to jump through, but all said, it just seemed like they realized they were in a unique period of time where they had an opportunity to do something that's never been done before, and they were just interested in doing it. So they did. And it wasn't a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, I like that. It really came down to timing almost. They kept on coming back to this idea of timing. And you can't time a merger, I guess, but it just happened to work out. I don't know if it's like serendipity or they're pushing too much on, hey, we got lucky. But yeah, it really did feel like it was we were asking all these technical questions, right? Like, well, what'd you have to do with your LPs? And they're like, well, we just told them.
I like that a lot of this started with basically John just picking up the phone and calling him and saying, I have an idea. I like moments that stem from just, you know what? I'm going to call this person and I'm going to ask him about this, and we're going to go from there. And not like, hey, can I set up a time to talk with you a week from now for 30 minutes over Zoom? And
that's something that comes with just great rapport, though. Like when you and I started this podcast, I think we were in a similar position where you just kind of called me and said, hey, what about this thing? And I love that because it's that moment, which is really interesting, but it's the entire relationship before then that doesn't really get talked about as much.
I think it probably took a lot of humility on Chris's part to take on the Firebrand brand. It's no small thing to do a merger, which is, a merger of equals, and then basically sunset the name of a thing that you've been building and has probably been your baby for years. So I think that speaks to his commitment and his humility and his authenticity that he invests in with his founders. I imagine that was probably an interesting conversation, but at the end of the day, they have more funds now to write bigger checks, to lead more rounds, to hold more reserve capital. It seems like they've become an even stronger partner for founders here in the middle of the country.
Do you think if someone came to you who was a equal and said, hey, I want to merge podcasts with you for your podcast creative elements, but we got to scrap your name and we're going to take mine, how would that conversation go?
I don't know. I've never met anyone that was my equal.
What a pompous statement.
I'm just kidding. Just kidding.
I know.
I don't know. I feel like we'd have to have more conversations. Ultimately, I care about branding and I care about the power of branding and marketing. So I'd probably do what is best from the standpoint of what marketing and branding is meant to do. Would it be a hard pill to swallow if the brand that I came in with went away? Of course.
Yeah. I don't have the right term for it, and power couple keeps popping up into my head, but what a great, it's not right. I know it's not right. What a great pairing. I've found that whenever you have someone with a lawyer background and someone with an operator background, and you put them together, if they can work together, because a lot of times there is just it's like putting two of the same sides of a magnet together. They just jump apart from each other. But when you can find two people that work together like that, it's just like a superpower as a duo, I feel like. So I imagine that they're going to have some pretty great success here.
Totally agree. And we'll be interested to see if we see any other venture firms following this model. I feel like we've seen a lot of micro VCs start up over the last 5 years. So it doesn't seem impossible that some other groups may merge to give themselves more, financial power. But we'll see. It still seems unique, and it seems like it might be dependent on timing.
You know what? I want to pull on that thread a little bit before we close out here. There are a lot of micro VCs been popping up. There are a lot of single GP maybe 3-person teams popping up. And when you make that commitment as a venture capitalist, you're making like a 10-year commitment from your most recent fundraise. I wonder how many people aren't fully thinking through what that 10 years looks like and maybe have a little burnout, have a little, okay, I don't really want to do this anymore. I want to go on to my next thing. I wonder if we see an acquisition spree in the venture capital space. Maybe that's something people aren't really talking about or thinking about.
I could see it. I mean, if you go back to John's blog when he was talking about starting Firebrand and his first fund, he talks about how challenging it was. And he credits another venture capitalist who I forget her name, but she had a blog writing about the same thing. And the economics of it were like, yeah, it's a 10-year commitment. And at the size fund that you're raising, you are really setting up to not make a lot of money personally for the duration of that fund. So I think a lot of people are probably in that boat. And maybe it would make sense for some of them to join forces to give themselves a little bit more breathing room to do this thing for 10 years.
In which case, maybe there's a really interesting financial company that'll pop out of this that just goes around and buys venture capital portfolios.
Upside Financial.
What a terrible name.
Well, if one of my equals comes and tries to give me a different name, then maybe I will.
Oh, it could be an Upside SPAC. That could be us. The Upside SPAC.
I've seen SPAC all over Twitter. I don't know what it means.
You don't know what the acronym means, or you don't know what it is?
Both.
Special Purpose Acquisition Company. It is a company that takes public investment and invests in and buys out private companies, essentially.
Super interesting. We'll save that for another episode.
All right. Well, this episode has been super interesting, Jay. I learned a ton. And listeners, if you want to hit up Jay or I, you could reach me on Twitter at EKHornung or Jay at JKlause, CLOUSE, or you could reach out to us at Upside FM. If you have something a little longer, send us a note at hello@upside.fm, and we will talk to you next week.
That's all for this week. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear what you think about this episode, so tweet at us at UpsideFM or email us hello@upside.fm and let us know. You can learn more about us and browse our entire back catalog of episodes at upside.fm. And if you love our show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. That goes a long way in helping us bring high-quality guests to the show.
Rocky and Sylvester. One for underrated, two for underpaid. Today I'm gonna get it